Today's going to be a pretty quick review. I'm reviewing Cujo by Stephen King. This book was published in 1981. It is the 12th published work. And I'm going to go ahead and say that I love Stephen King. I have always loved Stephen King. I've always loved Stephen King. When I first got into reading, Harry Potter was the series that really got me into reading young adult books. And then when I got a little bit older and was probably in junior high school, I really got into Stephen King. Uh, I've loved him as an author. I've loved all his works, some more than others. And I've been collecting his books for a long time and reading anything I can get my hands on by Stephen King. Having said that, this book, Cujo by Stephen King, is not one of my favorites, and I'll tell you why. This story, Cujo, is a very simple story. And that's not a bad thing. Simple fiction can sometimes be the best. A short, simple story can sometimes be even better than a complex narrative. But in this case, the whole story of Cujo really centers around a mother and her son stuck in a car and a rabid, uh, rabies infected Saint Bernard trying to kill them. And that's what everyone knows about Cujo, and basically that's the entire story. But because it's Stephen King, it's nearly 500 pages, and I just don't think this is necessary. It could have been a great short story, or probably at best a novella. I think if this story was maybe 150 pages, 200, it would have been a really exciting read. But reading this, I would say it wasn't until page 176 that Cujo the dog had rabies and did anything exciting. There's a lot of slow narrative here, and Stephen King has this really verbose writing style where he's describing a lot of details but not saying very much. It's been well documented that Stephen King has admitted recently that he didn't even remember writing Cujo. He had such a drug and alcohol problem at the time that because of his abuse, he has no memory of writing this novel. And I hate to say this can be a bit telling. I just don't think it's one of his better works. In Cujo, Stephen King writes characters that I find to be a bit too simple and not as complex as his famous works. In the Shining, or a famous Stephen King's book, Jack Torrance is an alcoholic, but he has such a complex character to him that it takes the whole book to understand how he's coming undone. In this book, there's characters that are just very simple and they're basically stereotypes, and there really aren't anything to them. I think Stephen King always had this thing in his early days of fame where Stephen King himself would claim, "Oh, I'm just a simple guy. I'm an everyman. I'm just someone that needs a nice pair of blue jeans and a Harley Davidson motorcycle, and I'm happy." And that's good and great, but in this book, he creates these characters that are very simple, working class characters. One was a veteran alcoholic from, I believe it was Vietnam or Korea. This alcoholic veteran, and then another was a mechanic. And there's nothing about these characters that are different than their stereotypes. And I think compared to the later works of Stephen King, or even the earlier works with the Stand and the Carrie and Salem's Lot. He wrote characters that were a lot more complex. And I really didn't find this book to be scary until the very end. There are usually Stephen King books tend to follow a rule of thumb that the earlier Stephen King works tend to be more of the scary stories. They seem to be the more lasting narratives that you think about when you think about Stephen King, and then his more recent works are a little bit of the lesser works. But even saying that, there have been some Stephen King books recently within the last 20 years that I really liked, like Doomakey. That's one of my favorite stories. Doomakey is one of my favorite novels by Stephen King. And I think he wrote that in 2008. So he's Stephen King. I mean, he's the best. He's always writing fantastic books. But his earlier works are usually the classic Stephen King novels you think about. But Cujo really just doesn't seem to hold up. Uh, it's still a good story, and Stephen King is a fantastic storyteller. I think Stephen King's a better storyteller than he is a writer. He's a great writer, don't get me wrong, but the stories he tells are fantastic, and they're better than his actual prose. There's some awkward writing in this book where he's describing like bodily functions at, at these long, nauseating sentences where you're kind of feeling like, why is he describing these um, gross situations with such describing these gross situations with so much detail when they aren't blood or gore or part of a scary narrative. They're just talking about bodily functions. Um, I would say this book really picks up at the end. I would say the last maybe 40, 50 pages is where the story really takes off. And don't get me wrong, this book is still excellent at the end. It is terrifying. And the reason it is so scary toward the end, when everything culminates, is this could really happen to someone. A dog with rabies could really go wild and try to kill you and your family. And the scene at the end is complete horror, and it really shows that Stephen King is the king of horror. But overall, this book, in my opinion, did not have the qualities of some of the classic Stephen King books like It, The Stand, The Shining, Carrie, some of those titles that everyone knows with Stephen King. I think this is one of his lesser works. But having said that, if you're a big Stephen King fan like myself, you should definitely read it just to say that you've read it and that you understand this part of his work. I think if I had to rate this book out of 5, I would say I would give it maybe a 1.5 or a 2 out of 5. I still love Stephen King, and it's really difficult for me to dislike a Stephen King book, but I just really couldn't find myself falling in love with Cujo. So that's my thoughts on Cujo, 1981 by Stephen King. Thank you. Happy reading.